in the Middle Ages, there's only one group of people who can read books, who can get books, who can do rituals, who can do stuff in Latin, who know all this theology and philosophy that allows them to do this. There's only one group of people in the Middle Ages with those kinds of skills. It's priests. And we know now that, Olaf the farmer is not going to be able to recite a bunch of weird stuff in Latin to summon a demon. The only people capable of doing that kind of stuff, the only people with access to books and literature, was the priestly class. And so we now know, and we now have good evidence to believe that a lot of the people engaged in these kinds of demonic shenanigans in the Middle Ages were priests. So much so that layer of priests is now referred to as the clerical necromantic underground.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, that's what they're officially known as in the literature, the clerical necromantic underground.
Dr. Justin Sledge is a professor of philosophy and religion whose work engages religious studies in Western esoteric tradition, particularly in religious and philosophical thought. He is the host and creator of a fantastic and fantastically popular YouTube channel called Esoterica. Dr. Sledge, Justin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I'm just gonna start with this. As soon as I hear esoteric or occult mentioned, my brain immediately conjures up some sort of a sinister image. For example, something like that infamous scene in Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. I don't know if you've seen that
Oh yeah,
film.
yeah, it's a great
The creepy
scene.
masked ball.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us have that instant association when we hear these words: esoteric, occult, arcane. Has the occult always appeared that way in the collective consciousness?
Not entirely. I mean, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, occult just meant hidden. In the same way that we don't see gravity, they would call that an occult cause. And so the idea that there were apparent and occult causes was just a basic factor in the medieval world and the Renaissance world. So no, the world occult is only really since the 19th century had come to have a kind of more or less negative connotation. But I mean, the most famous book of occultism, the three books of occult philosophy, written by Cornelius Agrippa and published in 1533. Yeah, it faced a little resistance, but ultimately it was published, and it was actually published primarily because Agrippa was good friends with the Archbishop of Cologne. So this is a kind of book that, at some level, the Inquisition, the Dominicans didn't want to see published, but at some level also there were other elements in the Catholic Church that were totally okay with the idea of it. So it's mostly a contemporary idea that the occult is somehow linked with, Satanism or diabolism or evil, something like that. So it's a more contemporary connotation of the word.
But when it comes to the origin of these ideas, can we even talk about a set of ideas that are consistently associated with these traditions, or am I completely jumping the shark here?
It just depends. There's a lot of scholarly debate about to what degree esotericism or the occult represents a coherent, theory or a coherent system of thought or tradition or what have you. I think that in general, the way that I typically frame it is that we can talk about sort of what has been allowed into the canon of Western thought. So we all know Immanuel Kant or Hegel or whatever. Even someone like Karl Marx. Marx is very polarizing, but we all acknowledge that he's part of the Western canon. You can also think about the idea that there's a bunch of folks who have been excluded from the canon that we don't teach, that we actively want to forget, or that we've suppressed. And in general, the idea is that there's a grab bag of that kind of material, whether it's magic or alchemy or Kabbalah, mysticism, witchcraft, or whatever, that we've rejected as sources of knowledge. We do not, as a popular kind of idea, think that there is anything to be learned from alchemy or from magic. We think that basically those are failed theories of nature or religion or whatever. And so that grab bag of failure and rejection and suppression and oppression is generally how scholars have grouped esoteric thought. And so this is an idea pioneered by a scholar named Walter Hanegraaff. And so that's kind of the way that we group it. Now, are there lines of thinking in those forms of thought that are somewhat continuous or connected? Sure. For instance, the idea that the microcosm, the world down here, is a mirror of the macrocosm, of the larger cosmic structure of the universe, and that one can manipulate the macrocosm by manipulating the microcosm, and in between, that there's a profound sense of connectivity through the world. Yeah, those are ideas that certainly are part of the broader scope of Western esotericism. But is there sort of a general agreement? No. You would see things, the ancient Gnostics, for instance, or profound dualists, whereas the ancient Hermeticists were profound monists. And so that's a deep sense of philosophical tension. But in the sense that neither the Hermetics nor the Gnostics have become part of the dominant intellectual culture, means they all get thrown in the same uh, rubbish bin of history that we now call Western esotericism.
Oh no. Okay, you brought us down a couple of pegs. So from that glamorous masked ball of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut to a trash bin of discarded ideas, quite the fall there.
It's quite the fall, but at the same time that we can talk about sort of the trash bin of history, it's not like this stuff ever went away. It was a case that Dominicans and the Inquisition tried to burn people for believing this stuff. The Enlightenment pretended that it vanquished all superstition or whatever. There's always the idea that this stuff is always there, and occult spirituality and occult ideas, Gnosticism, they're all there, and they're in some sense more popular than they ever have been before. There are probably more Gnostics in the world now than there ever was in the ancient world. There are probably more people who identify as witches now than there ever was, for certain, in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. So, in a way, the desire on the part of Western history to suppress and repress these kinds of ideas has spectacularly failed. The success of my channel, Esoterica, is a great testament to the fact that there's enormous interest in this kind of material. And so, in a sense, it's the waste bin of history. But in another sense, this is a place where people are extremely interested to go back to what has been allegedly forgotten or repressed or has gone extinct. And it's turned out to be an enormous mine of spiritual and philosophical importance for people. So much so that we're now going back, for instance, to the history of philosophy. You can talk about a philosopher like Hegel. Hegel's had an enormous impact on modernity. And we can go back now and see, oh yeah, actually it turns out that Hegel was deeply influenced by all of these kinds of ideas. And those kinds of ideas have had their impact, even if in a way that we don't often recognize.
Interesting. Okay, but just to resolve it once and for all. So it's usually just stuff that sort of did make it into a certain religious canon, and then people just ran with it outside of official doctrine until it became sort of a separate thing. So kind of like what alternative rock is to stadium rock.
Yeah, I suppose that's a way of. Yeah, it's
Okay, that's the best analogy that I could
yeah,
muster.
back when it was still cool to, like, it was Nirvana in the late 80s, early
Grunge.
90s, as opposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's so it's like that. But yeah, in the sense that it's the underground. In fact, we even refer to, sometimes we could talk about the Platonic underground. This is the underground version of Plato. This is the clerical underground. We talk about priests practicing necromancy in the Middle Ages. So yeah, this is sort of the hipster version of religiosity and spirituality and philosophy.
Okay, you said that this sort of vilification in an organized manner kind of begins in medieval era. But, I went to Bible school, was raised as a Catholic. I'm not religious anymore. I'm from Eastern Europe. And I remember a story that deeply resonated with me, or maybe I should say it really scared me. It was about King Saul, king of the Israelites before David, and he consults at a certain point towards the end of his reign the witch at Endor, I believe, and she conjures the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who's dead, and the spirit tells him that God has abandoned him. But consulting a medium is apparently, even in those days, such a sin that it becomes one of the reasons why Saul has to die soon after. So that was pretty harsh, if you ask me. And we're talking about thousands of years before the medieval era. So there were certain ideas that were already kind of not grata in those days.
No, that's true. I mean, the Hebrew Bible has this great story of Saul visiting what in Hebrew is called a Baalat Ov. We don't know what a Baalat was. We don't know what that means actually. It means the master of the Ov or the mistress of the Ov. The Hebrew there is a bit mysterious. That whole story is very strange. The spirit of the prophet coming up from the earth is referred to as an Elohim, a god. And so, what exactly is going on with that whole story is extremely strange, especially when you read it in the original Hebrew. But yeah, there's always been a sense that there are boundaries. The living should not muck about with the dead. The living should not muck about with demons. That these entities are dangerous. And yeah, it has been the case that part of what religion does is tell us what are the boundaries. And religion has always had, and this is true of science and other things as well. We always talk about the idea of playing God, that there's worry, there are anxieties around things like atomic power. There's worries around things like, genetic manipulation. People talk about, you shouldn't be down there playing God, manipulating the genes or unleashing the power of the atom. And those kind of anxieties have been there well before science, that there are powers in the universe much more profound and perhaps dangerous, and human beings are relatively stupid and shouldn't mess about with them. So I think there's wisdom there. I think that we should tread carefully, whether it's with demons or up and down quarks and the strong nuclear force. And I think that there's wisdom in those traditions. At the same time, I think that it's also very important to know that uh, prohibition is always two things. Prohibition's always evidence that people are doing something. You don't ban things that people aren't doing. And secondly, prohibition's always an invitation to do it. Uh,
Oh, yep.
Always. So anytime you prohibit something in history, we can always tell, well, there were people doing it. You don't prohibit things that people aren't doing. And the moment you pass a prohibition is an invitation. Prohibitions are always invitations. And so in the history of thought, most of what I study is always been prohibited. And that prohibition is a red flag for me to say, what were people doing? And further, when the prohibition came down, for instance, in 1389, there was a prohibition issued by the University of Paris against the practice of sorcery. A dozen or more things were prohibited by the University of Paris for students and faculty to not engage in certain kinds of sorcery. Well, that immediately tells me that the sorcery is going on at the University of Paris, and it also tells me what kind of sorcery was being done. And then it's interesting that we see an increase in magical manuscripts after that. It's a Streisand effect. The moment you prohibit it is the moment that it becomes uh, all the rage. All the cool kids want to do sorcery once you prohibit it.
You said that there's some wisdom in these boundaries sort of imposed by religious dogmas. Could you speak more about that?
I think that part of what religion does when it does its job well, and this is true of any kind of legal system, is that legal systems give us boundaries. And what is it? Hegel, again, I feel like I'm on a Hegel kick now. Hegel said that freedom is the recognition of necessity. And I think that there's some deep wisdom in the idea that human beings, and I'm the father of two small children, and one of the things I've learned as a parent is that boundaries and rules and rituals and regulations and structure actually provide for flourishing. That creativity means nothing if there aren't boundaries. If you can't transgress a boundary, then the creativity doesn't mean anything. You're not Creation means that there is a something and a nothing, and that you've done something as opposed to done nothing. That's what creation is. Creativity requires boundaries. Now, it also requires that you test those boundaries and transgress those boundaries at times, and this is why we need artists and philosophers and other kinds of people to do this. But I do think that we benefit from institutions and from other kinds of systems telling us, pump the brakes on that. Like, that's maybe not the best idea. And again, I give the example of people like to, all the rage these days is people loving text about summoning demons. And, there's kind of an edgy quality of the idea of people wanting to summon demons to do whatever. And to me, that sounds like a terrifyingly stupid idea. It sounds like the beginning of every horror movie ever. And people ask, like, why would you? What's so bad about the idea? I'm like, would you let a bear in your house? Would you invite a gangster, like a hardened mafioso, in your house and make a deal with them? Everyone realizes, like, you're gonna get the Russian mafia like in your house to have dinner and like make a deal to, like, the Russian mafia is gonna get you a girlfriend. That's a terrible idea. Would you let a tiger in your house? Like, and the idea that you would let a demon in your house, much less an angel. Angels are far more terrifying, in my opinion. Uh, you would muck about with that. It seems patently stupid to me. Um, and so, again, this is a thing that people do allegedly, and I think that tradition, when it comes out and says you wouldn't let a bear in your house, why would you let a demon in your house? And that seems wise, wise to me. I don't even want squirrels in my attic, much less a demon in my living room or my kitchen. We set traps for mice because they get in our food and cause us trouble and can get us sick, much less a fallen angel. What are you doing? So
So
I
in
think
no
there.
tra- Yeah, please go ahead.
So I think there's wisdom in it. And again, now, is there wisdom in burning people alive because they're doing it? Probably not. I don't think that's the best solution for what to deal with heterodox or unorthodox religious belief and practice. Obviously, the church and other institutions that have engaged in mass murder of women, especially during the witch trials, that's horrifying and rightly to be condemned. But I do think, even as an atheist, I'm not a theist myself. Even as a non-theist, you know, um, we could have pumped the brakes when we were developing the atomic bomb. We could pump the brakes when we began to experiment with biological weapons, which I'm sure we're doing now. No one ever thinks to pump the brakes while they're doing it, and I think there is wisdom in traditions that ask, that the wisdom in traditions that tell us that can does not imply should. That can does not imply should, and I think there's wisdom in that.
Okay, going back to the demon trend just for a second, I had no idea that's a thing right now. Is that like a TikTok thing?
I don't know if it's a TikTok thing because I stay away from TikTok because it terrifies me. I'm far more scared of TikTok than I am demons. But
Amen.
um, yeah, yeah. The most in general, I think the largest trend in occultism, so far as I can tell, when you sort of look at the Reddit and the other kind of the publications, is there's a vast interest in people interacting with demonic beings, and that seems to be a quite popular kind of occult pastime. It's a bit beyond me, but that seems to be a thing that people are interested in. There's a wide variety of publications on this, and again, my job as an educator is not to tell people what to do and what not to do. That's not my job. I don't want that job. It's not my job to preach to anyone. But insofar as people are interested in spiritualities like that, my job is to inform folks of the history, how this developed, the actual material culture. What do the manuscripts actually say? What does it mean to summon a demon when you have 15 different sigils for these entities, or 150 different manuscripts that describe how to do it in all kinds of contradictory ways? Now, my job is not to resolve that. My job is simply to say, the guru on the internet that's telling you that you can summon a demon to get a girlfriend is probably lying to you, because they don't have access to manuscripts that I have access to, and I can guarantee you, when you actually look at the manuscripts, it's a mess. It's a mess. In the same way that when a Christian or a Jewish person or a Muslim tells me that their religious scriptures are completely non-contradictory and everything comes from God and it all makes perfect sense. I read Hebrew, I read Greek. I can tell you that's not true. In the same way that I can be like, well, if you want to summon a demon, you got to fix this manuscript problem because the manuscripts don't agree, and you might try to summon Paimon and you get Belith. I don't know. So yeah, the manuscript tradition is a bit of a mess. But yeah, as an educator, my job is to lay out the historical reality of these kinds of practices, not to have jurisdiction, thank goodness, on what people do and don't do.
Also, must be quite a lonely exercise in futility summoning demons. I don't
Yeah,
know.
there's a great T-shirt, right, where like there's a bunch, there's people like I want a friend, and so they summon a demon to go play basketball with them. This is like,
Oh, I would love that. I love basketball.
yeah, it's a great.
So,
There's a
is there
great.
in any traditions? Is there demons who could be like cool roommates, or are they always like a bit of a downer?
No,
to hang
it
out
seems
with?
if you look at the literature, most of them seem like they're, I mean, some of them are pretty bad, some of them are pretty evil, but most of them seem relatively easygoing.
Interesting.
They can teach you ethics and rhetoric. They can teach you how to
Really?
find buried. Oh yeah, they can teach you how to find buried treasure, get a girlfriend. And again, this is part of the Christian mythology about demons, right? Is that demons used to be angels, and because they used to be angels, God farms out as like work proletariat workers, right? All of the jobs in the universe, the angels. God doesn't do everything. God's like the boss of the universe. So the angels get all the jobs. And because the angels get all the jobs, they're responsible for controlling the weather or making gold or controlling, love and things like this. So the angels get all the jobs. And many of the angels that were in heaven, according to Christian mythology, well, some of them rebelled against God and were thrown out. Well, just because they were thrown out doesn't mean they've forgotten all the stuff that they knew. They still know all that stuff, and also they're really old. They've been here since the beginning of the world, and so they know a lot about the world and how the world works, and they've seen the Roman Empire come and go, and so they know everything about sort of the ins and outs of history at some level. And so they're extremely knowledgeable, and they're extremely like well versed in the functioning of the universe. And so in many ways, part of what summoning demons is kind of hacking the universe. You're summoning a fallen angel who's an expert at blah 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 blah, and then you're basically using divine names to bind that demon to get them to do stuff for you. So it's a bit like capturing a wild animal and then using that wild animal, forcing that wild animal to do X, Y, and Z. And so, yeah, these demons allegedly are quite good at a huge range of things. And we have historically demonological catalogs that tell you the name of the demon, how to summon them, what holy name will bind them, and what they're good at, what they can do and what they can't do. And so we have pretty extensive literature from history telling you, what these demons do. And, if you want to find buried treasure, there's a demon for that. If you want to learn languages, there's a demon for that. If you want to control the weather, there's a demon for that. And so it's a bit like it's a bit like a phone directory, as much as those used to exist, where you look up a demon and you call them and you use magical powers to control them, and you get what you want. So now, to be clear, St. Augustine makes the argument that I find actually very interesting, that most of these demons can't do the things that they say they can do. They can only create illusions, and that the demons are all engaged in a long con. They make you believe that you can summon them and then bind them and make them do stuff. And they might do things for you, but ultimately they're only doing that because they're really in control and they're conning you. And ultimately what they're trying to do is doom your soul to hell. And so Augustine has the argument that yeah, you think you're controlling them, but at the end of the day, they're older and smarter and wiser than you, and that they're in fact conning you. And again, the same way that you think you might be making a deal with the Russian mafia, you're not making a deal with the Russian mafia. The mafia is making a deal with you. And at the end of the day, you're not in control of the situation. When you go into debt to the mob, you never get out. And in the same way that when you go into debt with a demon, you never get out. You are the mark at the table. The old saying, right? If you don't know who the sucker at the table is, it's you. You're always a sucker at the table when it comes to demons, according to Augustine. And I think again, if you look at the history of these entities, that has to be true. I mean, it just seems obvious to me. Like I said, in the same way that I'm not going to take a loan out from Vladimir, with all the tattoos on his knees and stuff. I'm not going to take a deal with a ancient malevolent deity, quasi deity.
So people compiling these Rolodexes with like demonic entities, were they just inventing stuff out of whole cloth? Because I don't remember hearing about any of this stuff from our local priest when I was going to, Sunday school. Now he was drinking a lot, and that was his favorite like pastime activity. But even so, like I don't remember any of this kind of like armies of demons, fallen angels that you can trap with magic and that sort of stuff. It just didn't feature prominently in our catechism. So where is this
Yeah,
stuff coming from?
I think it would probably be in the best interest of the Catholic Church, given that they're hemorrhaging believers, to focus more on this stuff, because I think at least would hold people's attention more than the homoousios or whatever it is that that they're selling. So the traditions go back really far. There are demonological catalogs that go all the way back before the Common Era, before the birth of Jesus. There were Jewish demonological catalogs that go back to things like the Book of Enoch, and maybe even prior to that. So yeah, this literature goes back a couple thousand years at least, maybe probably more. And what you see primarily is that there's an interest in early Judaism, and this is around the turn of the Common Era, a couple centuries before the Common Era. As you can easily imagine, things have not always gone well for the Jewish people. And insofar as things have not gone well for the Jewish people, one of the things that the Jewish people have asked is like, why is the world so bad? Why is life so terrible? And,
Yeah.
and one of the answers has been, well, demons. Like the world's just populated with evil. In fact, the
Oh, that's
Talmud says
convenient.
that
Yeah.
it's a good explanation for why the world's so bad. It's just full of demons. In fact, the Talmud even says that that if you could see demons, that's all you would see. There's so many demons that if you could see them, you wouldn't see anything else. They're so ubiquitous. The world is a pandemonium. In fact, that literally means full of demons. The word was invented by John Milton for Paradise Lost. But the idea is that there must be something responsible for all this evil. And obviously, evil comes in lots of flavors. There's all kinds of evil in the world. There's war and disease and greed, and there's lust, and there's all kinds of evil. And so, one of the ways that they thought to deal with this problem was by assigning basically some kind of malevolent entity to all the various flavors and species of evil in the world. And so many of the demons actually end up with names of the particular evil, right? The particular evil attached to a divine name. So you might get a demon like that's a good example of a demon, Samael. Samael is sort of the closest thing in Judaism to the devil, and Samael means the poison of God. It's like it's a pretty metal. I mean, literally, there's a band called Samael, and so like you get all these demonic beings because basically you need somebody to explain the forces of evil. Of course, the angels do the opposite job, right? You get Raphael, God heals, and so the opposite of God healing people must be God poisoning people, and so Samael, the God's poisoner, or the Malach Mashchit in Hebrew, the destroying angel, the angel of death. So that's kind of where you get. And so it's not hard to imagine that the world's populated by a bunch of evil beings, and that's why evil exists in the world, or at least how evil happens. And ultimately, what ends up happening is, well, if God is ultimately in control and God made all these beings, and we're on the side of God, perhaps it's the case that we can use God indirectly to bind these demons to get them to do stuff for us. In the same way that we can capture a wild horse, break that horse, and then make that horse carry chariots around or whatever. And so there is a logic here. It is not completely crazy that you can bind demons and make them do things. Evil clearly exists in the world, and you can also manipulate evil, and you could use evil to the interest of the good. Now, of course, this was never a widespread acceptable practice. You can't do bad things in order to do good things. But sure, I mean, there's definitely necromancers in the Middle Ages that would say things like, "Yeah, I use demons to find buried treasure, but then I also give some of the money to the church." um, and of course, the church is not going to be super about that. But I suspect that if you showed up to a church with a bunch of gold, they're not going to ask a lot of questions about exactly where it came from. And to your point earlier about your drunken priest, um, in the Middle Ages, there's only one group of people who can read books, who can get books, who can do rituals, who can do stuff in Latin, who know all this theology and philosophy that allows them to do this. There's only one group of people in the Middle Ages with those kinds of skills. It's priests. And we know now that, Olaf the farmer is not going to be able to recite a bunch of weird stuff in Latin to summon a demon. The only people capable of doing that kind of stuff, the only people with access to books and literature, was the priestly class. And so we now know, and we now have good evidence to believe that a lot of the people engaged in these kinds of demonic shenanigans in the Middle Ages were priests. So much so that layer of priests is now referred to as the clerical necromantic underground.
Oh my
And
God.
Yeah, that's what they're officially known as in the literature, the clerical necromantic underground, which I literally have on my channel merch. Like, what a great band name.
That sounds also like a chapter of a particularly scary video game.
Yeah, again, that should be a movie. And we know that because of the distribution of texts and the distribution of literature around this, that there must have been a lot of them, because we see texts traveling over Europe, and that we see them getting copied. And it must be the case that one cleric goes from one town to another. He must know someone who's connected to this underground network. They exchange information, and that information travels. And it's so ubiquitous through Europe that there must have been a relatively thick layer of these necromancer priests who are active in the church. And we know that because not only do we have the actual empirical evidence of the manuscript tradition, but also on top of that, we just have prohibitions on it constantly. We have constantly the church being like, bishops, get your people, like, stop. You cannot have these exorcist priests doing necromancy on the side. You cannot have a necromancy side hustle. But we know that they did, because imagine you're a person in the Middle Ages. Life is crappy because it's 1380, the plague or whatever, infant mortality, all the things that we know about how bad the Middle Ages were. So you pray to God at the church, and God doesn't answer the phone. So then you pray to Mary, and Mary doesn't answer the phone. So you start the priests. The priests don't answer the phone. The saints or whatever. If no one picks up the phone and your kid is sick, your animals are sick, you don't stop. Everybody knows that Father so and so at two parishes over is able to bind demons and get stuff. So no one in their right mind, if their kid is sick, is just going to stop. You're going to knock on the God door. You're going to knock on the Jesus door. You're going to knock on the Mary door. You knock on the saint's door, and then you're going to knock on the necromancer's door. And you're going to keep knocking until either you run out of doors to knock or it works. And we should not think that medieval people are fundamentally different than anyone else. Of course, when we're in dire straits or when we want something really bad, we're going to knock on every single door until we get it. And it's unsurprising that necromancers in the Middle Ages were ubiquitous.
Speaking of that, I just read a really disturbing account of some nobleman in France who fought with Joan of Arc, who later became a saint.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy was an aristocrat. I think his name was Gilles de Rais,
That's
and
right.
he fell into debt after the war, and then he started summoning demons in his castle. But the person who apparently aided him with all this stuff was a priest, an
Mm-hmm.
Italian Catholic priest.
Right. And not falling. I mean, they were just like part of the church. It was just oh yeah, yeah, they were kicked out. I mean, they were, they, again, part of the power, the part of the binding of these demons is you have to have divine grace. So at some level, you have to be a priest. You can't be a sinner. You can't be a bad person. It requires that you actually be a Christian in good standing. And the question of Gilles de Rais or the Templars, who were also executed in mass because allegedly they worshiped some demon named Baphomet. Uh, Again, there's always the question that when there's debt, and when there's the church, and when there's political power, is there demon worshiping going on here? Is there summoning going on here? The famous story of the Ledun possessions. This was a very important moment in the 17th century, where a bunch of nuns allegedly were possessed at a convent, and they accused a bishop a priest, a popular priest, of summoning demons. And there's really no evidence that he was involved in any of this at all, actually. And so this is a very powerful mechanism by which to basically get your enemies executed. And in fact,
Comes in handy.
it's a very efficient way, because you can't prove you didn't do it, and it's really easy to fabricate evidence that you did. In fact, they're in the Ledun case, they were able to fabricate a signed pact with the devil with demonic signatures and stuff. It's quite a lovely piece of work. But it's these kinds of things that when people are accused of it, when we go look at it in history, In some cases, the evidence is quite good. We have a character like Cecco d'Ascoli who was accused of necromancy, who also made a bunch of enemies at court. He was ultimately executed by burning in the 14th century. But we do know, without a shadow of doubt, that he wrote books of necromancy. His book of necromancy survives. He basically copped to it in the trial. But in other cases, people like Gilles de Rais or the Templars, I think that the evidence is much more, let's say, flimsy. It's much more of a kangaroo court, I think, in those cases.
So we talked about how a lot of this kind of knowledge, or a lot of these traditions were not vilified, were not on the bad side of an authority. But then in the Middle Ages, it flips. Could you talk about that a little bit? Why does that happen? When does that happen? And what exactly happens there?
So some things have always been on the bad side of the law. Summoning demons is never a thing that you're going to be able to get away with in Orthodox Christianity. But something like alchemy or astrology is a great example. Alchemy, we now think of as sort of occult or esoteric, but with few exceptions, the alchemists were never persecuted by the Inquisition or persecuted as sorcerers or whatever. Astrologers were never either, very rarely. In fact, astrology was taught in university classes. So it was an official thing that you could go take a class at the University of Cologne and learn how to do astrology. So what ends up happening is that through the Middle Ages, there is a growing sense among Christians that, one, the world's coming to an end. That's just sort of a thing Christianity has built into it, the imminent end of the world. That goes back to the earliest Christians. And there's also the idea in Christianity that Satan and God are at war, that the earth is a kind of battleground in the war between Satan and God. And in the Middle Ages, the idea was, as the world gets closer to coming to an end, Satan intensifies his war. The war gets amped up. And of course, what Satan wants to do is outrage God, is insult God. And the best way to do that is to take human beings who are made in the image of God, the closest thing Satan can get access to in the form of God, even better than the angels. The angels are sort of, again, angelic, they're workers. But they're not made in the image of God in the same way that human beings are. And insofar as Satan can get access to us and our soul and then damn us, send us to hell, he can destroy little micro regions of the image of God. And so insofar as the world's coming to an end, Satan ramps up his campaign to outrage God. And the way that Satan does that is primarily through getting demons to tempt people into doing things that will ultimately get them damned. And what's more tempting than power? There's nothing more tempting than power. Power is the most tempting thing of all. And so what can the demons do? They can pretend to give you powers. And what emerges in the church is the idea that Satan has introduced the final heresy. And the final heresy is the idea that human beings can make a pact with demons or with the devil, and that pact allows them to contravene Christianity. And insofar as they contravene Christianity, they're able to get powers while on earth. This is a Faust story. And this idea is these people, particularly women, are able to accomplish this through making pacts with the devil. And this is the final push against God, that the devil has a final heretical move. There's been all kinds of heresies in the past: Gnosticism, Marcionism, all the different isms, Arianism. But this, right, is going to be the final gesture. And the church unleashes massacre to try to stop this. And that becomes basically the early modern witch trials. So in a sense, the church early on viewed sorcery as one sin among other sins. Yeah, you summoned the devil, that's bad. You had adultery, that's bad. You stole, that's bad. Come to the church, get your confession, say your Hail Marys, and you're done. Beginning in around the 13th century and then into the 15th century, sorcery becomes less and less thought of as merely a sin, and it becomes associated with a heresy, that you are in fact a heretic. You've abandoned Christianity, you've made a pact with the devil, and you're ultimately trying to destroy Christianity in league with the devil. And that transition of sorcery from a sin to a heresy brought you under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. and inaugurated the witch trials as we know them. And of course, the witch trials executed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women. So that's the big transition. Sin, heresy, or rather sorcery, goes from just a sin to becoming a heresy. And that transition is decisive in European history.
Is that just sorcery, or do these other, I don't know what to call them, disciplines, like you said, like astrology, etc., divination, whatever, do they fall suddenly under the same kind of interdict?
Sometimes alchemy. One famous inquisitor in the 14th century named Nicholas Emmerich tried to argue that the alchemists were in fact sorcerers. That argument didn't work. Most inquisitors rejected that argument. But yeah, astrology, divination, even medicine, they all became not associated with it, but they all became sort of like, what's the right way of putting it? If you were practicing a lot of astrology, and if you began to, again, we have to remember, right? Medieval people thought that demons lived in the air. They lived in the space between the earth and the moon. They didn't live in the earth. They didn't live in hell. Hell's where they go at the end of the world. But right now, they live in the earth, and they live in the space between the earth and the moon. That's why medieval people thought where demons lived. And because you're dealing with that region up there, well, that's where the demons live. And there's always a bit of suspicion that if your astrological predictions are like making you rich or getting your enemies hurt, or they're weirdly accurate, well, maybe you're not just like looking at the planets, maybe you're also up to no good. And so, yeah, there's always a sense of if you're too good at what you do, or if you're out late, or if you're in the woods by yourself a lot, or you're a little too educated and you have a lot of weird books, well, you might be up to some kind of necromancy or some kind of consorting with demons. But no, astrology, alchemy, not ipso facto, but never be too good at what you do, because it might be the case. If you go from being poor to all of a sudden now you're rich because your alchemy worked, the Inquisition is going to ask some questions about where all that money came from. And if you don't, and same with the IRS, right? The government, if you get rich all of a sudden, they're going to wonder. And if you can't give them good proof that you converted lead to gold, they're going to be like, where did you find this gold? Where did you get this gold? And yeah, they're going to knock on your door. So yeah, these kind of other disciplines, not inherently associated with sorcery, but there's always a tinge. There's always a tinge of it.
I never quite understood the following. Like, if I kind of grasped the dogma of the Catholic Church at the time, and maybe I'm completely wrong here and way off, but that miracles were sort of, or supernatural events are reserved only for God. So everything else is superstition, because these sort of events or powers can only come from God Himself. And yet, like you say, a lot of people get persecuted. So I don't know how to square the two. Maybe my first premise is doesn't hold water.
No, you're that's certainly the official position of the Catholic Church, right? That you're only God can do miracles, and that's right. And so or right, at least according to the Catholic Church. The position that emerges is that yes, the demons can't do supernatural things. They can't do that, but they can do trickery. In the same way that I don't know if you're when you're younger and your uncle could like make a quarter coin come out of your
Yeah,
ear,
yeah,
and you're
yeah,
like, oh
yeah.
wow. When you're 6 years old, you can believe your uncle can take a quarter out of your ear. Well, demons are a lot more powerful than your uncle, and they're a lot older, and they're a lot smarter, and they can do a lot of tricks. And they know a bunch of stuff. And so imagine the kind of illusions and the kind of trickery they have up to them. And so in the same way that a 6-year-old you can believe that your uncle can pull a quarter out of your ear, well, 30-year-old you could be tricked by a demon who's 6,000 years old and can do all kinds of stuff. And so the Catholic Church argued that the demons can't do supernatural things, but they can trick you. And that trickery can be pretty damn convincing. I mean, I've seen, I don't know, magicians who I know don't have supernatural powers, but I have no idea how they're able to like find the card or make the thing disappear or to make this happen over there. I have no idea. I mean, they can trick Penn and Teller, some of the best illusionists in the world. Well, if human beings can trick people, all the more so ancient demons. And that's the grift. That's the con, is that the demons can't, but they can make you believe that they can. And the Catholic Church is like, please don't be tricked by these entities, because at the end of the day, yeah, they can trick you into doing things, and they can trick you into believing things, and they can even, like, for instance, demons can't control the weather. This is the main thing that in the Middle Ages worried so many people, was that sorcerers and witches could cause weather magic. And weather magic doesn't seem terribly terrifying to us now, but if you live in an agricultural society where a single hailstorm can destroy your entire crop, the idea that a person can summon a hailstorm and ruin your crop, you starve. You can destroy a whole community that way. And so weather magic, and you look at the earliest depictions of witches, they don't look like witches in the way we think of them. They just look like women, and in the background almost always is a hailstorm. It's weather, because we associate thunder and lightning with witches and stuff, because we still associate with weather magic. Well, witches can't cause the weather to change. That would require divine intervention. But what can demons do? Well, the demon hunt these manuals will say things like, well, demons can't control the weather, but they can fly, and they can go really high up in the air, and they can see where bad weather is coming, and they can tell a woman or a sorcerer, hey, if you do the summoning on Tuesday at 5 o'clock, then I can guarantee you at Sunday, I'll cause a storm to destroy your neighbor's crop. Well, what's happening is the demons can see the storm coming, and they trick the person into believing that they're summoning the storm, but the storm's coming anyway. It's just a demon can fly, go up and see the storm over there, and this is the way that this is the way that the Catholic Church officially believes that demons can trick people. They're not really causing the storm; they're just allowing the dupe to believe that correlation is causation. So this is the kind of way that it works. So no, demons can't cause things according to the Catholic Church, but they can trick you, and they do know a bunch of stuff. So in the same way that we would think of psychological manipulation, can a demon get you a girlfriend? No, but do demons know a little bit about, like, psychological manipulation? Yeah. And so in the same way that, like, pickup artists, these kind of Andrew Tate demons, those kinds of people can teach young men allegedly ways of picking up women. That's kind of what demons do. And so they can't get you a girlfriend, but they can teach you techniques of psychological manipulation to do that, or whatever. So again, there's a lot of wisdom in the church's position that these demons are like, they're deviant. They don't really have power, but they can trick you into believing that they do. And again, we can look to people now who are like cult leaders who are able to engage in psychological manipulation of people, and we look at those and go, this is really dangerous. Why would you make a deal with someone like that? You're probably being conned by them. And no cult member will ever tell you they're in a cult. Never. Because they've been brainwashed to believe they're not. And this is what the church is going to say. Of course, the church is ironic, right? They're going to, tell you that you're not in a cult. But they're going to tell you these entities, yeah, they can make you think that you can change the weather and find a girlfriend and get buried treasure. All of these texts include buried treasure, by the way. Because why? Because obviously they should. Everyone loves buried treasure. But at the end of the day, you're only going to get this stuff if you make a deal with them, make a pact with them, and the pact includes your damnation. And you're going to spend eternity in hell, despite the fact that you found a bucket of gold coins. Who cares? That's the danger of it all. But again, never doubt. I mean, how many people would sell their soul? How many people have made deals with the mob for a couple $1,000s? And now you have to go, like, kill somebody because you did that. People make deals with the devil, with a variety of devils, all the time, all the way down into contemporary times.
Yeah, it's super easy to judge, but your illustration earlier about, desperate people in medieval times who have, like, sick kids and nowhere else to turn paints a different picture. So it's, it's easy to understand.
Yeah, this is part of also what I have to do as an educator. My job is I don't believe in this stuff. I'm not a occultist. I'm not a magician. I'm not a whatever. But what I dislike is this sort of enlightenment, positive, like you said, making fun of these people, mocking them. Oh, the stupid, superstitious medieval people. And one, we're not better than them at all. We still do the exact same stuff they do, just in different ways. And secondly, there's a logic to what they're doing. There's a reason. There's a deep thinking that goes on here. This is not just silly, superstitious people doing random stuff. This all is completely reasonable within the system of thought that existed at that time. And in the same way that we make stupid, short-sighted decisions that all make sense within the horizon of where we are as contemporary people, I think that part of what I do as an educator and what I want to do is never convince anyone of any of this being true, but to convince everybody that these people are people, that they made decisions based on what they knew. They made reasonable decisions, that there was a logic to all this, and that they're reasonable, and we should not think of them as backwards and silly, but we should look at them in their historical consequence, in their historical setting, and sympathize with them. We should humanize them. We should look at them and empathize with them, because the more that we can empathize with people who made those kinds of decisions back then, admittedly perhaps bad decisions, the more we can recognize that same behavior in ourselves now, because we're not fundamentally better. We're not fundamentally smarter. We're not fundamentally wiser, to be sure. We're still making the same decisions, the same logic. We still live with a lot of the same mythologies. I mean, the UFO stuff is just sort of low rent demonology. The idea that there are secret people from space coming into your house and kidnapping you and doing stuff, weird stuff to you, that's just like contemporary demonology. And the fact that like, oh, we're like, oh, but that's demon, that's superstition, we're talking about aliens from space. I'm like, do you have any evidence for any of this? Like, oh, you underwent hypnosis. That sounds a lot like the kind of confessions that people went through in the Middle Ages. We're just rehashing a lot of the same mythologies, a lot of the same ideas, and we paint it with a scientific brush. Oh, they're spaceships and not demons coming from space. But it's always just demons coming from space. So we're not different than them. We're, and again, this stuff goes to, we're in Congress in the United States. There are congressional hearings about aliens that there's virtually no evidence for any of it, aside from some blurry photographs and some, FLIR footage that's highly, contestable. And the idea that we're better than them, and the fact that we're having congressional hearings about space guys, I don't think at all, there's not a lot of light between us at the end of the day. And the more that we believe there is, the more we repeat that kind of stuff.
And it's odd because we're all carrying like HD cameras in our pockets these days, but we still don't have like a clear video of any of it, even though there's like a million alien sightings.
Oh, of course. And again, in the same way that, there's 1,000 stories of demons in the Middle Ages. And
right.
I think very few people are going to say that's good evidence for the existence of demons. Some people will, I'm sure. But I trust, again, we're all carrying around HD cameras, and yet we've still not got a good image of the Loch Ness monster or a ghost or a demon or a UFO or whatever. And yet these ideas persist, and persist again, not just persist, but persist at the level of congressional hearings. It's extremely important to not denigrate the past. William Faulkner, who's from Mississippi, my state, said that the past is not dead. It's not even past. And the more I study the Middle Ages, the more I study the ancient world, the more people seem strange at that time. To other people, the more I see the same behaviors, the same thoughts, the same kind of mythology. Of course, it's been renovated. It's got a new, fresh, coat of paint. The QAnon with the elites kidnapping children to get their adrenochrome. I'm like, yep, I've heard this one before. This is just the blood libel. Like, this is just a new version of the blood libel. It's no longer the Jews, although sometimes it is the Jews. But it's not the Jews. It's the elites or the globalists, kidnapping children and doing terrible things to them to extract their adrenochrome. I'm like, yeah, we've heard this story before. Like, and we know what it leads to. Like, we know what these kinds of mythologies lead to, and whether it's the Jewish blood libel in the Middle Ages, the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s, or these modern versions of these conspiracy theories now. We live in a world deeply penetrated by mythology, and the more that we think that we're not engaged in mythology, the more certain we make it that we will be.
Yeah, I'm from Slovenia originally, and Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, is also from there, and he has like a similar thought about ideology. The more you think you're outside of ideology, the more deeply entrenched in it you actually are.
Yeah, I think that what was it? Jean Baudrillard said that he has the best comment about the film The Matrix. That The Matrix is the kind of film The Matrix would have made.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more that you think, yeah, and to Zizek's point, right, and to Marx's point, and this is also true of Guy Debord, right, the Society of the Spectacle. The more that we are an observer of the spectacle, the more that we are spectacular. And that's true for me too. I'm a YouTube person. I have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. At some level, not only am I exposing the history of this stuff, but I'm also entrenching it. I'm doing both. There's no way that I'm not also. There's no way I can guarantee you that me discussing all of the things that historically underlie, for instance, the summoning of demons. There's absolutely no way that I'm also not inspiring someone to go pick up one of these books and go try it. I know at some level that I'm both a dispeller of ideology, but also an inspirer of ideology, and and that's true of every educator. The moment you teach a class on how bad the Nazis were, there's always going to be one student in the room who's it's like fascism. That kind of maybe. So
A sobering and frightening thought, but I think you're right.
I don't think we get to do. I don't think we get to. We don't get to have. Again, we don't get to enjoy the ideology that somehow education is liberation. Education is always empowerment, and empowerment is a very neutral thing. And insofar as we live in a network of ideology, it's always going to do empowerment in a certain direction, and that direction is never something we get to control.
Okay, if we bring it back to these occult traditions, were mystical experiences an integral part of these?
So yes and no. It always depended. It depended a great deal on when and who had those mystical experiences and what were the result of them. So if you had a mystical experience that, in some sense, was containable and made sense within the cultural framework, then fine. You have someone like Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard
Yeah.
had a wide variety of mystical experiences, and she became a pillar of the church. She's a doctor of the church. She's like Thomas Aquinas now, and her works are widely celebrated. And you can go, Hildegard interacted with some of the most important Christians at the time. Bernard of Clairvaux and popes and stuff were all about that Hildegard life. Other people like Marguerite Porete. Marguerite Porete had mystical visions, and her mystical visions did not line up with the official position of the church. The Inquisition had her arrested, basically told her to stop teaching the things that she was teaching. She said, I can't. This is what God showed me. I have to tell the truth. And they burned her alive. So it all has to do with the horizon of what is acceptable and in some sense of what is acceptable within the context of the church. So some mystics did very well. Some mystics became ashes. Now, when it comes to magic and stuff, some forms of magic were about mysticism. We think of Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. That was a book ultimately that was all about using magic as a vehicle to have a mystical connection with God. That's very controversial, and controversial now. It's controversial then. So someone like Agrippa was very much interested in the meshing of magic and mysticism. Other magicians were just like, they were just mercenaries. It was the idea that if you pay me enough, I'll summon a demon to find you some treasure. Sure. But it had nothing to do with mysticism whatsoever. So mysticism intersects with a lot of this stuff, but mysticism could exist on its own as a completely orthodox thing, but also it could go off the rails and get you killed, and it could have nothing to do with magic whatsoever. Although I will say again, mysticism is always a bit tinged with danger in the medieval times, and even now, because the church at the time, we have to remember, like the church had religious hegemony. In fact, it just had hegemony in spiritual matters in general, sometimes in political matters. The church is the mediator between you and God. And insofar as you had a mystical experience, you cut out the middleman. You were having a direct connection with God. And
A dangerous game.
That's a dangerous game. And there's no business, there's no hustle in town that wants you cutting out the middleman if you're the middleman. And so the church always had to keep a sometimes a tight leash, but sometimes they give you a long chain. But the leash was always there. And so if you're a Hildegard, yeah, you had a leash on, but you would get a long chain. Sometimes they couldn't keep you on the chain and they had to get rid of you. And so there's always a push and pull when it comes to mystical experiences, because like I said, it cuts out the spiritual middleman. And that of course was the medieval church. And ditto, right? If you were a necromancer and I could promise that you could get all kinds of powers by doing X, Y, and Z, well, why go back to the church? If you have a sick kid and I summon a demon and the demon develops a cure and your kid gets cured, the saints didn't pick the phone up. Mary didn't pick the phone up. Jesus didn't pick the phone up. The church didn't pick the phone up. Why go back? You have an immediate access to power. That's pretty tempting. And the church knew that. And so that's part of also what's militating the church, is that they're like, yeah, we don't want people, shopping outside of Amazon. You need to come to Amazon to get what you need to come to Amazon. We don't want any competitors, and so no Temu, no one go to that. And so that's also what's militating with the church, is that they have a spiritual monopoly, and that spiritual monopoly comes with political and economic power, and they don't want people upsetting it. And demons, apparently could upset that monopoly.
On the other hand, people who were practicing these things, do they account for it in their manuscripts on how they are achieving these mystical experiences? Do we know anything about that, or is that always just like plop there as a matter of fact and just appears?
So we get some sense of how they're doing it. So one of the things that's important to know, that the word for spell in medieval Latin often was the word experimenta. And in many of these manuscripts were meant to be used. They weren't, pristine, beautiful, illuminated manuscripts that were just meant to be read. These were working notebooks, and many of them are garishly marked up with all kinds of notes in the margins and notes in the middle of the line, because they were actively tinkering. They were like, oh, I tried to summon the demon at this time and it didn't work, but then I tried it with Saturn in the ascendant and it worked. I heard the demon talk to me or whatever. And so we actually see the working notes of some of these necromancers in their notebooks, and in that way they're really, really fantastic glimpses into what this was. Now, I don't know what that means metaphysically, whether they really heard a demon or not. They thought they did. And this is, by the way, just true of in general. In Middle Ages, people saw ghosts, they saw saints, they saw trolls, they saw dragon. This was just ubiquitous. And so much so that in medieval records, you'll see things like, I went to visit my cousin, and then I did this, and I came back over here, and then I saw a troll under this bridge, and then I went over to the market, and modern people are like, huh? Go back to that troll part. And they mentioned the troll part just as like they went to the market and saw their cousin. The world of the supernatural was just a part of supernatural, was just part of their world. People saw ghosts and apparitions and demons all the time in the Middle Ages. It was just a fact of life that we don't experience in the same way. This is also true, by the way, in many parts of the world. I was in Egypt once, and I was in a village in Egypt, and I was asking people about jinns, and people were like, "Of course, there's jinns. Like, so and so is married to a jinn." I'm like, "Married to a jinn?" They're like, "Yeah, Muhammad, he's married to a jinn." And so I went, I was like, "Can I meet Muhammad?" No, sure. Went over there and met Muhammad. And I was like, I heard you're married to a jinn. He's like, "Yeah, it's Aisha. She's right there." And I could not see anyone sitting there. But everybody in that village was like, "I've seen Aisha. You don't see her all the time, but sometimes I've caught a glimpse of her. And she's really a jinn." And far be it for me to judge anybody and get in anyone's metaphysics and look down my nose at people. That's not my job, and I don't want to do that, and I won't do it. But people's interaction with the supernatural world, to this day and in the Middle Ages especially, is much different than ours. And so we ask of things like, sometimes people leave comments on my channel like, how could people believe in that? It never worked. Why would anyone do that? And my response is, there are billions of people in the world right now, in churches and mosques and in synagogues and temples, all praying. There are billions of people right now somewhere praying for something. And I don't know that God has ever answered any of those prayers because I'm not sure there is a God. But the idea that those people were stupid for practicing magic because it never worked, I got news for you, man. There are billions of people who are religious, intensely religious, their entire lives, and it works. They believe it works. They believe that their prayers have been answered, their kids have been cured, whatever. It's just as reasonable for those religious people to believe it works as it was for medieval people to believe they were summoning demons and doing things like that. So, or rather, I could say it's both equally reasonable and unreasonable at the same time, I suppose. But again, this is the weird historical myopia that we have, that we look back at the Middle Ages and say, why would anyone do that? Because that clearly doesn't work. All the while, they're like standing inside of a church, you know, praying to a saint to help them find their car keys or whatever. There's not a lot of light between those positions, but it's hubris that militates the idea that we're different. It's just hubris, but we're not fundamentally different. And this is also true of atheists, Marxists, for instance, right? Marxists love to pretend that they're materialist and they have this materialist theory of history and all this. It's apocalyptic beliefs. You believe that the bourgeoisie are the bad guys and you're the persecuted minority good guys, and there's going to be a climactic final battle between the good guys and the bad guys, and after that, after the apocalypse, there'll be heaven forever and communism. This is just Christianity. This is just like the book of Revelation. It's just like the Marxist version of apocalypticism, but that kind of apocalypticism goes back to Joachim of Fior, and it goes back to the church, and it goes back to the book of Revelation, it goes back to the War Scroll, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is just a new version of apocalypticism. It has some new paint on it, and I say this as a Marxist. I am a Marxist, but I also, again, keenly aware of the fact that we have to be a bit more white-knuckled and a bit more transparent about the fact that we are not discontinuous from history. We are part of the continuity of history. It's the most Marxist thing that one can possibly say. You are part of the continuity of history. And the continuity of history means we never escape the trajectory, the intellectual trajectory of the world that we're born in. And I say that even as a Jew. Jewish apocalypse is a huge part. Messiah and all this stuff. Like we're never outside of it. And so again, to go back to Zizek's point, we should admit our insidedness, and that's true for materialists, but also looking back on the past and thinking somehow that they're fundamentally stupid or backwards or something like that. It's a position militated by hubris, not militated by actually studying history.
Yeah, I'm a lefty myself, but I'm completely what's the word I'm looking for here? Enchanted by a whole host of superstitions and stuff, and I've just given in. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna get rid of it.
I think it's the first line
Let's be
from
honest here.
Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground.
Right.
I'm far too intelligent to be superstitious, but I'm superstitious nonetheless. Yeah, I think that it is not. The question is not whether we're superstitious or not. The question is, what did Lacan say? It's not a question of alleviating the symptom. It's that we must learn to enjoy our symptoms. And I think Lacan is right. The cure to ideology is not to get outside of it. The cure is to find the cynical, ironic kind of jouissance, the enjoyment of ideology, and we have to learn to enjoy our symptoms, because all we are symptoms.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
That's truth be told.
Oh yeah. I mean, you're a psychosis, perversion. You're somewhere on these. Again, my Lacanianism is coming out, but yeah, enjoy and learn to come to enjoy your symptoms, because there's no outside of the symptoms.
Right.
Personality is symptomology.
Yeah, agree 100%. Now you have such a wealth of knowledge on your YouTube channel, and you go really deep on a lot of these thinkers, a lot of these esoteric traditions. What is the most genuinely mind-boggling school of esoteric thought or philosophy that you've ever come across and that has left an impression on you?
I would say that without doubt, the most mind-boggling moment for me in the history of Western esotericism is the conversations between Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly and angels.
He was at the court of Elizabeth the First. Is
That's
that
right.
the astrologer who was?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
astrologer. Yeah. So John Dee was one of the probably the smartest guy in England at the time. This is 1580s.
Okay, so not just some con man who
No,
was.
no.
Okay.
His scryer might have been a con man, but and he was in fact he had his ears cut off for previously engaging in fraud. But yeah, John Dee, this incredibly brilliant astrologer and mathematician, he coined the term British Empire. I mean, he was really the smartest, one of the smart. He had the biggest library in England at the time. In fact, his library became the cornerstone of what became the British Library. So this guy was a no joke intellectual, and he basically exhausted what he could find out in the world with books. And he was like, if I'm going to find what he called radical truths, I'm going to have to talk to the angels. And he tried, and the angels didn't respond. And so he brought in what is called a scryer. It's like a medium. That scryer was one of them. He had three of them over the course of his lifetime, three or four. And that scryer was a dude named Edward Kelly. And Kelly was admittedly a con man, but also he had a weird talent, as much as one can say this is a talent. And over the course of the next 7 years, we have documentation where Kelly and Dee talk to angels and demons. And that wouldn't be so weird, aside from the fact that at one point, the angels began to reveal to them a language, a distinct language called, what we now call it Nokian, but they never called it that. They called it the celestial speech. And you would expect this language just to be a bunch of gibberish in the same way that people talk in tongues, and it's glossolalia, and we know, glossolalia has, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
Meaningful,
It's
but
also a bit funny, to be honest.
it is, yeah, it's a bit strange, and but it's semantically meaningless, and that would be fine if it were glossolalia. The problem is that this Enochian stuff has grammar and syntax and vocabulary, and it was revealed backwards in reverse order, letter by letter, over the course of weeks. And as a young person, when I discovered this, I was learning Latin at the time, and I had my taste of grammar. I knew grammar was hard. And I also knew that you couldn't fake grammar. You could fake a bunch of nonsense, but you couldn't fake conjugations and declensions, and you couldn't fake that backwards in reverse order with like no cribs. And this like fired my imagination. I was just like, look, I'm not sure if I believe in any of this, but something's going on here. Like, this is not just like people knocking on a table in the dark and saying they're talking to spirits. You can fake that. Something's happening here. And that, I learned about this when I was 14, I think. And I ultimately ended up going to graduate school studying Western esotericism, partially inspired by this whole thing. And it's easy to believe that this was just a con, and but Dee and Kelly made decisions that you would never make if it were just a con job. Dee was told by the angels to go call out in court the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, and he went in front of the court and called out Rudolph II to his face, called him a sinner and told him to repent. Like, that is not a smart thing to do. Edward Kelly took a wife that he didn't want to take because the angels told them to do it. They swapped wives at one point, had sex with each other's wives because the angels told them to do it, and they did it. And it's these poor women, of course, in the midst of all this, is nightmarish. And these records are preserved. We have the exact records. Dee, in fact, hid them in a chest, and then they were discovered a little bit after Dee died, and they were published subsequently. And the manuscripts all survive. I've worked with the manuscripts. That's the strangest moment. And it's strange because there's this language aspect to it. There are these angels talking to these guys. It lasts over the course of 7 years. There's just so much going on there that whether you believe in the supernatural or not, it just cries out for some kind of explanation. It cries out for some kind of investigation. It cries out for, what in the hell is this? And I went to graduate school and I wrote several papers on studying it. I've written, I think, the authoritative paper and trying to give an idea about what went on there. And I think that's, to me, the strangest in all of this. But there's other stuff. Aleister Crowley and his weird stuff. There's a bunch of
sorry, did you say Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, Aleister Crowley. He had very there's strange instances of him summoning demons and things like this. Um, there's very strange Gnostic texts that
So
have,
this is kind of like the modern occultism, right?
right, Aleister Crowley's early 20th century, up to the mid 20th century. But I look at texts like he also summoned some of these spirits that John Dee allegedly did when he was in the desert in Tunisia and either Algeria or Tunisia. And the records of his text are extremely weird. And I don't. Again, like I said, I don't believe that there are spirits and angels and demons. That's because I don't have evidence for them. But it also might be the fact of, like, imagine a person born deaf telling you there's no such thing as music. I might just be deaf. I might just be the spiritual equivalent of, again, a person born blind telling you that colors don't exist. You'd balk at that. You'd be like, what are you talking about? You just can't see them. You can't hear them. Well, Aleister Crowley or John Dee or whoever might tell me, yeah, you're just blind and deaf. Don't tell me this is not real. I'm experiencing it. I'm seeing it. And it could just be the case that this is a limitation. This is about my limitations and not about what's true. But all I can say is I don't believe it because I've never experienced it. I'd be happy to experience it. But I also try to cultivate some degree of humility that, yes, science hasn't detected these entities. I haven't experienced them. But is that the end all be all of things? I try to be open to the possibility that the world is certainly stranger than we have ever thought that it was. And I'm not going to get in the business of saying what isn't there. My job is to be open to the possibility and to look at the data. And if I can find reasons to believe that it's not there, if Edward Kelly's a con, or Aleister Crowley was high or something, fine, right? But also, I think that we run into a moment where people experience things, and I have to say, I can't tell you what was there or not there. What I can tell you is they experienced something. And as a historian or as a philosopher, I have to be honest about the fact that I'm going to run up to a wall. And once I hit that wall, the only intellectually respectable thing to do is say, I don't know. I just don't know. And I think any philosopher or historian who wants to tell you they've cleaned up all the mess and that everything makes sense and that their worldview is fundamentally supported by all of the data, you're not dealing with an intellectually serious, intellectually honest person anymore. The data is I think, very much in contest and very much debatable and highly inconclusive.
To be completely honest with you, my first instinct when you were recounting the story of Aleister Crowley going to the desert and what was it, seeing angels, was, yeah, dude was probably high. He just took some mushrooms or something.
and he did. I mean, we do know that he was experimenting with all kinds of psychedelic drugs and stuff. But again, in the same way that psychedelic drugs might be ways that we alter consciousness and they cause hallucinations, it could just as well be the case that, in the same way that lots of people take DMT and lots of people see, like, machine elves.
Yeah.
Is the DMT causing them to see the machine elves, or the machine elves there and DMT gives them the ability to experience them? Again, I'm pretty skeptical they're machine elves. I've seen the machine elves and I've done DMT. I've seen the machine elves. And I remember looking right at them and being like, I don't know what to do about this because I don't believe in you. And yet there you are.
No conversations there? Just
no, it's always the case. I've never, the few times I've done DMT and seen these kind of entities, they don't really take much notice of me. And I've heard this too, that a lot of cases they'll sort of be in the hall of the machine elves and they'll see them, but the machine elves are kind of like, doing their own thing or whatever. So yeah, I've seen them. And again, I've taken lots of different psychedelic drugs and I've seen God on big doses of LSD. And they're always the same. I always tell God the same thing. I'm like God, you always show up when I'm on LSD. You never show up otherwise. Like, you got to do a brother a solid and show up on, like, Tuesday at 3. Let's have coffee and let's talk. But you keep showing up when I'm on 500 micrograms of LSD. This is the kind of it's not fair, dude. And all I can say is God's never shown up, when I'm not on, LSD or whatever. But, at the same time, am I going to tell someone who's had a profound experience on psychedelic drugs, or not, just meditating, that they've not experienced fundamental reality or Brahma or whatever? I'm not going to tell them what they haven't experienced. That's not my job. I don't have the intellectual ability, spiritual ability to do that. What I can say is experience is not always a predictor of reality. I look out my window and that house over there looks really small. That's because that's the way vision works. The house is not actually small. I walked over there to it; it will get bigger. The moon looks bigger, closer to closer to other buildings. Right? When you take your phone out, take a picture of it. Everyone's always disappointed that it's not as big in the picture as it is in your sight. That's because we have, visual hallucinations about size. We've all felt our phone vibrate in our pocket and checked it, and nothing happened. This is a very contemporary, very ubiquitous form of hallucination that we all experience all the time. And I think experience is not always a great indicator of what's true and what's not true.
Justin, last question. I'm a big fan of tarot, and I don't even know if that is in the domain of the esoteric. And I don't know, I'm just like trying to ask you as many different things as possible that I'm
Yeah.
interested in. You can tell me to, piss off or whatever. But if you do know anything about where it comes from, what the deal with tarot, the present form that we have, how did we get here? If you can give me anything on that, I'd be super grateful. But if not, fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in tarot. This is one of the places where I don't know a lot. I can say this: that tarot began as a game. There are lots of tarot decks. There are lots of different tarot decks that existed. Primarily, they developed in Italy, and there are half a dozen, maybe a dozen different kinds of tarot decks and different games that people played. And the relationship between games and divination has always been very, very thin. Games and divination have always had a very close relationship, whether it's throwing dice or whatever, and throwing knuckle bones and things like this. So there's always been a relationship between games and divination. This is true actually worldwide. And what ends up happening is that the various games that ultimately are associated with the tarot cards as we know them, those games have largely fell out of focus, although some of them still exist in places. But ultimately, what ends up happening is that the tarot deck becomes associated primarily with divination, and then it becomes the foundation, along with Kabbalah and the Golden Dawn, where the various tarot cards and Kabbalistic stuff like the Tree of Life, along with I Ching and lots of other things, become sort of all mapped onto each other, and that becomes a grand system of magic developed primarily in England in the 19th century. And it's through those mechanisms that the tarot becomes extremely popular. And the Rider White deck and other kinds of decks that develop are also just popular divination tools. But divination's always been associated with games, and yeah, we should be unsurprised that that's how it developed. But I'm not an expert in tarot. Although I will say that I never had someone read tarot cards to me before, and it just so happened that last summer or summer before last, I was at the Rittman Library, which was the largest, most important library of Hermetic and occult literature in the world. It's an amazing institution. It's in Amsterdam, and they had an original copy of the Rider White tarot deck, an original. And there was a person there who was an expert in tarot, and they asked me, "Would you want a tarot reading?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know if I believe in it, but I'm not going to pass up an opportunity for my first tarot reading to be done with an original copy of that deck." And the librarian said, "Yeah, it's fine. Feel free to do it, and be careful of the cards." And so that was my first tarot reading. So I don't know if I'll do it again. And the person who read it was very lovely and did I don't know, again, I don't know what I believe about that, but it was a fantastic experience, and a real honor to be in such a prestigious institution. If you're going to have something, if you're going to have a moment, have a moment, and that was certainly a moment.
I am certainly jealous. Justin, thank you so much. This was such a fantastic conversation. I could take like 24 hours of your time and still not have enough. But please, everybody, go check out the Esoterica channel. Fantastic stuff. Once you start, you will not be able to stop, I'm afraid to say. But yeah, do you have any other social media that you're on where people can follow your work, or is Esoterica taking up
Esoterica
all
is
of your
it.
time.
I'm just on YouTube. Yeah, just on YouTube. Social media, like I said, scares me more than demons do. I'd rather deal with the devil
Words
himself
of wisdom.
than deal with Twitter or Facebook or whatever. The modern demons are more scary than the ancient ones, so I just deal with the ancient ones. So
So
yeah, you can
beware
just
of Andrew Tate.
yeah Andrew Tate and Elon Musk and
Yeah.
all I'd rather deal with Belial and Beelzebub than deal with than those guys. So yeah, you can just find me on Esoterica on YouTube, where I talk about this stuff again from an academic perspective. I take an academic take on this, and so what you can be guaranteed is on the channel, we take a look at this from an academic, scholarly, data-driven, evidence-based point of view, and not I took a bunch of LSD and I saw the demons, which might have also happened, but it's
Right.
not part of how I do my channel.
Well, it's fantastic stuff. And you're close to like 1 million subscribers
Yeah,
almost already.
we're
I
we're
think it's
like
like
up.
800,000, no? That's insane.
I think we're somewhere in the 700,000s. Yeah, so it's a successful channel. I'm really grateful that it's successful, and it also just goes to show that people really want to learn about this stuff. Whether it's spiritual seekers want to learn about it, people just are interested in history who are total skeptics and atheists. But also, people writing novels also use the channel for research, for writing novels, and
Ah,
people doing Dungeons and Dragons.
interesting. Yeah.
DMs who really want to
Yeah.
make magic like really historically accurate. I have people all the time reaching out from Dungeons and Dragons world who are just really interested in getting magic right for their video game or for their novel or for their movie. Or so it just shows you there's a huge range of interest in this material, and people want accurate, scholarly, rigorous presentation of this material. And I'm really lucky that it's my job that I'm able to basically have a classroom that reaches tens of thousands of people and provides what I always hope to be accurate information on these topics, because so much of this stuff is not presented accurately. It's presented by crazy people and racists and conspiracy theorists and stuff. And I'm really glad to be able to, present the information without hopefully without a lot of my bias, and really present it accurately in a way that is accessible to people.
Do you sometimes get people who are like, I've knocked on Andrew Tate's door. He couldn't get me a girlfriend, so I'm gonna try with the demons. And do you have a spell for me or something like that?
Yeah, I get it all the time. I get emails.
Oh my
I get
god!
emails
I
all
thought
the
this was gonna be
time.
a joke, but it's actually happening.
No, yeah, I get emails. You can imagine religion attracts its own degree of mental health problems. You can imagine that occultism attracts a specific kind of mental health stuff. So I have to, I get a lot of emails from people who are clearly suffering from mental health problems, but also I get emails from just sad people who are in desperate situations. I get emails. I got an email just a few days ago from a guy, like, my wife is divorcing me. Can I can I use a spell to get her to not divorce me? I, I got nothing for you, man. Like, get counseling. Like, and the fact that you're looking for a magical spell tells me that, like, I mean, again, I'm not a psychologist or a relationship person, but the fact that you're turning to a random guy on the internet on YouTube to like fix your marriage tells me that you need, like, you need some help, dude. Like,
Right.
but yeah, I can't. And people, I always make it clear that I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a believer. I'm not a doer. I'm not a guru. But I always get emails that are like, I know you say that in public, but now that I'm your Patreon supporter, give me the
Oh,
give me the goods about Kabbalah or whatever. And I'm like, I don't got the goods, man. I hate to tell you that. I'm glad you're supporting me with like your $5 a month donation. Thank you very much. But I hate to tell you that I don't have any. And people are like, what if I give you $20 a month? I'm like, I have the same answer for you, man. I don't have. Like, dude, look, if I had magical powers, I would go win the lottery and I wouldn't be on YouTube. Like, there's, again, like, think about this a bit more, like, logically. I wouldn't be asking for Patreon donations on YouTube if I had magical powers. If I had magical powers, I'd be kicking it in a castle somewhere. Uh, I'm clearly not the guy with the magical powers. You're knocking on the wrong door, and you're not even thinking that clearly about why you're knocking on my door. You're just desperate, and I got no solutions for you. I'm sorry. So, yeah, I can give you scholarly access to this information, but I can't
yeah.
give you magical spells. Sorry.
Well, Justin, you're not the guy with the magical powers, but you are a guy with a magical channel which I again recommend to everybody. I couldn't stop watching when I started. So, and thanks again for taking the time. This was outstanding. So, thanks
Absolutely.
again.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. This podcast has no sponsors, no production team, and no editors. It's just little old me. And as such, I'm at the mercy of you lovely folks watching and listening. So please do subscribe on YouTube. Click that little bell thing. Follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, I don't want to sell you an ugly t-shirt that you don't really need. So if you can, and most of all, if you want, please support me on Patreon. And at this point, I have to express my eternal gratitude to my patrons on Patreon, aka the producers of this show. As always, without you comrades, this podcast simply wouldn't exist. So massive, massive thank you to Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž, Štrole, Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. You guys are the best.